this gonna? When are you gonna post this?
I'm thinking about posting it either today or tomorrow and Monday. In different pieces. See how it goes. But
Okay.
unless you have a preference, or
And I just wanted to know in terms
sure.
of time.
Okay. 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 Good morning, everybody. Steve Sabadeski, BodyBuzz.com, and today we have Tyler Bridges. Tyler Bridges is reporter for The Advocate, and he's covering the legislative session, and his focus is on tax issues. Tyler, good morning. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Steve.
Terrific, thank you. So it was a very busy week this past week up in Baton Rouge. Why don't you at least give some ideas to what is happening and what we can expect for next week coming?
Sure. The state is facing a 1.6 billion as in B, budget deficit for the upcoming fiscal year that begins July 1st. That budget deficit figure is if they were to spend as much money, the state was to spend as much money this year as next year, they're $1.6 billion short. Why are they short? Because the legislature and the governor last year decided to put a bunch of one-time money, $1 billion worth. One-time money means it's not available the next year. So it's kind of short-term fix. And they did that because they didn't want to either cut spending or raise taxes last year. And that put them in this year's situation. So how do you eliminate a $1.6 billion shortfall? Well, again, you raise taxes or you cut spending. And the feeling of the legislators is that the most they can cut another amount of spending is maybe $600 million, maybe $700 million. The rest would have to be made up with new tax revenue. And that's what we saw the House grappling with this week. The House, because they are the first ones that take up budget issues, raising money, spending money before it would eventually go over to the Senate. And the action this week, earlier in the week, was with the Ways and Means Committee, that's the tax committee, and they were dealing with a bunch of issues of whether to pass these different tax measures or not. They passed a bunch of them, and then on Thursday, the House voted on them. Now, I would call these tax increases. A lot of the legislators like to call them tax expenditures. It's that it's actually spending. These are not of the various taxes that eventually were raised on Thursday. Only one is a direct tax increase, and that would be on cigarettes. That's 32-cent per pack increase. The current rate is 36 cents. So a 32-cent more, and you get up to 68 cents, and that is what Mississippi's current rate is. So that's what the House did on cigarettes. The rest of the measures that they passed would trim various tax credits. For example, if you got a dollar for a tax credit for buying something or not paying something, now you would get 80 cents, or maybe you get 75 cents on the dollar under these various plans. And again, the legislators like to say these are trimming tax expenditures, which is the same as spending. And so on Thursday, when the House was done with its work, they passed 11 different measures that would raise a total of about $664 million. They were hoping to get up eventually to $937 million, so they're short $273 million. And the House members, the leadership said, look, if we're just going to cut spending, that means we're going to cut spending for LSU, Southern, UNO, all the other universities, public colleges and universities in the state, or healthcare. And they said we just can't make those cuts to healthcare or to the higher education system. They said we have to raise money. In fact, the figures show that in recent years, particularly businesses have been paying less and less in taxes. There's all sorts of new tax breaks that legislators and the governor have added to the tax code in recent years. So they said that's where we should go to raise this money. And so it said the ultimate result on Thursday was $664 million in new taxes.
So if we have a $1.6 billion shortfall, and we have roughly, I think, 940,000 that we have in terms of money that we need to raise, is it fair to say that the difference is the amount we're going to cut?
Yeah, there's various ways that you can cut spending by not giving pay raises, for example, or there's no inflation increase in pay. Certainly, if I had a job, I'd want, inflation goes up 2 or 3%. I'd want a 2 or 3% bump in my salary. But with state workers, they could choose not to do that, and so that would produce certain savings. And maybe you don't allow state workers to travel as much as before. There's various ways. You look for other ways to save money to do things smarter. Uh, but ultimately, if they're when they really make cuts that are of any magnitude, that's going to fall upon, again, LSU, Delgado, UNO, the various universities, and then the healthcare system. And a big issue for New Orleans, for example, is the opening of the new hospital, and they need the private company that's now managing it needs $88 million of extra money to manage it. And there's even the possibility that they won't open it if they can't get this money from the state. So there's a group of particularly Republican legislators, 25 to 35 of them, that say, I'm not going to vote for new taxes. I just don't think that's the right idea, that the government spends too much. The other side says, well, you can think that way, but that's going to mean cuts in the hospitals and the universities. And so the House passed, again, $664 million of taxes, and that now goes over to the Senate, and it'll go through a couple of different Senate committees, which can raise that amount. They could lower that amount. They could try to keep it the same. The guess is that they'll raise the amount, and eventually it'll go to the full Senate, and then ultimately it'll go back to the House to see if the House agrees with whatever the changes the Senate has made.
Now, you mentioned that part of the reason why we're in this fix is because we used one-time money last year, and wouldn't is it fair to say that we've been doing this for roughly ever since, as I appreciate it, ever since Governor Jindal took over, we've been using one-time money?
Well, to be fair to Governor Jindal, one-time money was not invented by him. But it's certainly grown to the largest proportional use ever last year by him and by the legislature. There's an anti-tax crowd in there. So faced with a budget problem, and they were faced with one last year, they didn't want to raise taxes. By now, they have drained all the various reserve accounts of the state, so they couldn't do that anymore. So they used, again, money that was available just for 1 year last year, and that's not available for this year. And again, part of that is by draining the last reserves. It's like emptying your bank account, and you got to pay the bills next month. Well, you don't have that bank account money anymore, and that's the situation the state is in this year. So this conservative Republican legislature is doing something that is a bit of a surprise, which is to raise taxes. Most of the tax increases at this point, because there will be changes, are falling on business.
Right, and Steve Wagaspack and Lobby are not too pleased. In fact, you asked a question to the governor during a press conference about Steve Wagaspack's comment about after Thursday being perhaps the largest tax increase in Louisiana history, and I don't think you got a direct answer from the governor. But you had an opportunity to talk to Wagaspack or any feeling in terms of what Lobby's going to do?
Yeah, well, the business community, they're protecting their special interests. They are, lobbyists, a special interest group. I find it sort of ironic, I should point out, that they say they're for free enterprise, but they are not for ending the film tax credit, which is a total tax subsidy, nor they are trying to eliminate the solar tax credit, which again is a subsidy, whether you think it's good or not. They do interfere with the free enterprise model. But lobby is going to, I'm sure, continuing lobbying legislators to not increase taxes. They say that's not good for business, not good for to attract businesses to invest here, not good for the economic climate. The Republicans who are raising taxes along with Democrats are saying, well, wait a second, what happens if we don't have the proper roads or the bridges to get goods to market, get people around, traffic jams? Or having a good economic climate also means not having layoffs of professors at LSU and UNO and Southern, and having courses dropped.
Okay, so Wagaspack is labeling what happened on Thursday as taxes, and the legislature is saying that everything is not everything, but the cigarette tax is not a tax. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, they're calling it they're trimming a tax expenditure. A tax expenditure is a real phrase. It's one that says that these are actually spending through tax breaks, an expenditure. And those tax expenditures in the state budget have grown enormously in recent years under this governor and legislature. And so legislators are basically saying, hey, we've gone too far. The pendulum went too far, and now we need to correct that. And the business community is saying, no, don't raise our taxes. Don't trim these tax breaks or tax expenditures, whatever you call them.
Now, I again listened to the interview, the press conference of the governor, and
Is that on NOLA.com?
yeah, actually, yeah.
And that
And
was on Friday, the press conference.
that was on Friday, and basically, as I appreciate what he was saying, was that we still have some time, that this is a process. You got to look at the big picture, not at one particular thing, and that's all he said. In general, in my view. So I guess my question is, by saying that you have to look at the big picture, and not just a single part. Do you think that he's made up his mind as to whether or not he would veto the entire budget if in fact, let's say the Senate just approved what the House voted on the other day? Is he going to? Yeah, go on.
It's clear. The governor has made it clear that if the Senate simply approved what the House did on Thursday, that would be a tax increase, a net tax increase, and if that was part of the final budget, he would veto that budget. We know that the Senate is going to amend the
Right.
House tax increases. The best guess is that the Senate, which is traditionally friendlier to higher taxes, is going to do that. The governor on Friday was very clear in saying, hey, I'm not going to make a real judgment at this point. Again, it was interesting. My question to the governor was, Stephen Wagaspack, who was formerly your chief of staff, says this is the largest tax increase in the history of the state in a single day. And this anti-tax governor did not go along with Wagaspack. Instead, he gave a much more nuanced answer, and he kept repeating that answer,
Right.
which is that, hey, it's early in the process. Let's see what they finally come up with. There's a lot of moving parts, and we don't know where exactly what the governor's views are on the various taxes raised right now, because there could be changes along the way. We do know in the end that if it represents a net tax increase in his mind, following the guidelines established by Americans for Tax Reform, that he will veto that budget.
But he hasn't identified which of those are actually taxes. I think what he's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what he's saying is that to roll back or to cut some of those, credits, tax credits, film credits, etc., there's got to be some cut elsewhere. There's got to be
He keeps saying if you can raise one tax, and that's okay as long as you decrease another tax.
But that doesn't raise any money, though. I mean, I don't understand that.
Well, there are ways that the government can raise it. The governor's rules on taxes are confusing. They're confusing to legislators. They're confusing to me at times. But there are some taxes that some people would view as a tax increase, but according to Americans' tax reform and the governor, it's not actually a tax increase. For example, the governor says if you eliminate tax rebates that businesses get, for example, for paying the inventory tax. Inventory tax is rather confusing because businesses pay it to local government to school boards and police juries and sheriffs. They get this money for their services in their parish. So businesses pay the money to local governments, and then they turn around and they get a tax credit for those payments to local governments. They get that tax credit from the state. So if a business pays $1,000 to Jefferson Parish for the inventory tax, then they turn around and get $1,000 from the state of Louisiana as a tax credit. Now, what happens if that business only owed $500 in other taxes to the state? Well, then the state would, so that of that $1,000 they get back from the state, $500 would actually be they would actually get a check written to them, and that other $500 would be a tax credit, would offset their other taxes, but they would actually have a check written to them, the tax rebate. And in the governor's mind, that those rebates actually are spending by the government. So if you eliminate those rebates, that is a spending reduction. Now, if you're a business and you're losing those tax credits, those tax rebates, to you that's tax increase. To the governor and to Americans for Tax Reform, that's a spending decrease and is allowed.
Okay, in Americans Tax Reforms, that's Grover Norquist's group. Now, what passed through the House was a reduction of that tax rebate of 20%. So instead
25%.
of getting 25%, okay. So instead of getting the $500 back, it would be 75. They would get 75% of that $500, $375, I believe it is, something like that. So where do we go from here? We go to this. The tax bill goes to, well, actually it goes to appropriations in the House. Am I correct? And then the Senate picks it up.
Well, the Senate, the House on Monday, the Appropriations Committee is hoping to pass its budget. It's the first draft of the budget passed by that will ultimately be passed by the legislature. Goes to the House Appropriations Committee. They want to pass that budget, and they want to fold in the tax increases that the House passed on Thursday, and they also want to take the $664 million raised by the House on Thursday, plug that into the budget, and where are they going to plug that of the various holes? And the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Jim Fannin, told me on Thursday after the votes in the House that their plan is to take that money and fully fund higher education. Fully fund higher education means that higher education would not suffer any cuts next year. That's been of great concern to King Alexander and Monty Sullivan and the other leaders of the higher education institutions. So Fannin is saying, okay, we're gonna make them whole. They're not going to suffer any budget cuts next year. But in doing that, that leaves all the other holes, and the biggest hole then that would still be unfilled would be for the healthcare system. And this is particularly, again, money for the new hospital in New Orleans that's opening up, the state money that would go for that, state money for rural hospitals, state money for the developmentally disabled, state money for state nursing homes where elderly people live. There's a big shortfall now there. So before Thursday, both higher education and healthcare, those systems were facing big deficits. So the House raised $664 million. The House leadership has made a political decision to direct all of that money to higher education, and then some of that money, there will be some money left over, and that will partially fund the hole that the healthcare system's facing. So now healthcare is out on a limb by itself.
Right, and maybe the limb is actually a little bit more brittle. Excuse me, because as I recall, the governor has had in the privatization of those hospitals use a funding process that has not been approved by the federal government. So, although we may not have to pay that money back this year, we might have to pay that back, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in the following years under a new governor. Am I correct there?
Yeah, you are correct there, but that's not an issue for what's
For this
going
year?
on right now. That's an issue down for the next governor and legislature. Right now, the situation is that the state lacks at least $200 million for the new hospital in New Orleans, which is opening for other hospitals that the management has been privatized, and there are threats that they could say, hey, you're not giving us enough money, state. We're just going to cancel this contract to manage your hospital, and that would cause chaos in the healthcare
Yes.
system. That there wouldn't be enough money for, the hospitals would have to cut back their service, particularly for the poor, children, pregnant women. And so right now, the question is, will the legislature raise more money to fund the healthcare system, and also state museums and parks are facing cuts in hours, and may not be able to. Some of them may not be able to open next year. So will the legislature raise additional money to pay for all that? And again, there's a group of particularly Republicans and a small number of Democrats saying, hey, I'm not going to vote for any more tax increases, especially not in an election year.
Sure. Now, I guess one of the last questions I have about this issue is, I'm hearing from different people who live in those Republican districts, and what they're saying is, look, let's cut. We don't need to raise taxes. We ought to just cut. Um, is there any? I mean, is there any discussion about doing that? I mean, obviously, we are going to cut. You described those cuts, but where
Yeah,
else?
Steve,
Yeah,
if there were, I certainly don't know 100% whether there are cuts to be made. I can say that we have a conservative governor and a conservative legislature, and if they're not and they are going to make some cuts, maybe as much as $700 million in cuts, maybe even more, to deal with this $1.6 billion budget deficit. But they are saying that this deficit is so big, they've dug themselves in such a big hole from, as I mentioned, particularly the use of one-time money, then the drop of oil prices has worsened the situation. That that the only way to cut beyond about the 700 million starts, cutting again UNO, LSU, Southern, Delgado, and the other higher education systems, and again the money for the hospitals and nursing homes and for poor children and their mothers.
what a sorry situation. Now, changing directions. I saw on the internet that you wrote an article for the Advocate, and it deals with Steve Scalise, who is the House Whip. He's from the Jefferson Parish area, suburb of New Orleans, and I think what the title is some like Act Two. Why don't you tell us what the title is, and why don't you, if you don't mind, tell us what that article is about?
Yeah, just a couple corrections, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I didn't write the piece for the Advocate. I wrote the piece for Political Magazine. I'm a
Oh,
freelancer. For
sure.
2 months, I'm working for the Advocate. So Political Magazine on their website yesterday published a piece, a long piece, probably the longest piece that's ever been written on Steve Scalise. And the title is the headline is Take Two.
Okay.
And what prompted Politico Magazine to ask me to write the article was the revelation in late December that in 2002, Congressman Scalise, then a state House member, had spoken before a David Duke group in Jefferson Parish. And then the question, there was Scalise, who's the number 3 House member in Washington, a very high position. He's ascended very quickly in Washington. The question then became, is Scalise a racist? Is he a Duke supporter? And Politico particularly turned to me because I'm, I guess, the world's expert on David Duke, having covered him closely back in the days when you and I got to know each other, Steve, when you were part of the anti-Duke group, and I was a young reporter for the Times-Picayune, and I ended up writing a biography of Duke. And so I spell out in this long piece on Scalise exactly who he is. Are there any ties? Raise the question and try to answer. Are there any ties between Duke and Scalise? Is there a pattern of intolerant racial behavior by Scalise? And I spent a lot of time with Scalise. He was very open with me. He answered every single question I asked of him. And so the results of my story again are on the website, Politico magazine.
Okay. Okay. Well, just leave it at that. You're not going to tell us any more other than that you talked to him and he was open. So I'm going to have to read the article right after this interview.
Right. Yeah. You work so hard in these articles. I don't want to give people the Cliff Notes version.
Well,
Read.
no, that's fine. Look, I don't blame you at all. Really, absolutely. Okay, good enough. Thank you again, and the work that you're doing is just absolutely exceptional. And good luck with the Advocate, and certainly more articles with Politico, the number one United States political magazine or newspaper, online newspaper, and I think again in the country. So that's really terrific. Thank you so much, Tyler.
Thank
And
you,
we'll talk
Steve.
to you. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks
Okay,
so
so let me
much.